need to move faster. Fundamentally, we've got to get much, much faster. And I really mean about moving beyond sustainable design and moving towards a responsible world. Now, I know we live in a world where environmental awareness is probably greater than it's ever been in modern times. We've got renewable technology that we're using more and more. We have electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles that we're using all the time. And buildings, that's what I do. I help design high-performance buildings. We're building them better than we ever have to date. But that's not always been the case. I remember growing up, I'm a child of the 80s, so I remember growing up in the 80s and 90s, and we were not nearly as socially aware or environmentally aware as we are today. And we had things like and we still do, Earth Day, right? That was the one time a year we all kind of rallied around and really celebrated the world. And we had, I remember this, we recycling, right? Everybody takes this for granted, but I remember being in grade school and recycling came about, and we had recycling in our house, right? That was new. That was the forefront of it. But at the same time, we had coal power plants, right? In the U.S. and the U.K. in the 80s and 90s, the majority of our power was coal. 50 to 60% of our power was coal, which is the dirtiest way to produce power. And the cars that we drove, they were gas guzzlers, right? We were more concerned about performance than efficiency. And the narrative at that time was very much around, fundamentally we knew we weren't doing the right thing. We knew it. As a society, we knew it. And there was this narrative that always talked about, well, future generations will help figure this out. Future technology will help figure this out. And as a young kid, you think future, right? This is the Jetsons. This is 200 years from now. This isn't in my lifetime. But it is. It's us. It's all of us. We're sitting here, and it's our responsibility. It's our generation. It's the Gen Xers. It's the millennials. It's the baby boomers. It's all of us. All of us are the ones that are responsible. But there are some significant challenges that we face. Time, one of them, but population growth is another. So we're sitting at about 7.5 billion people right now, and that's just growing. The rate of population growth is decreasing, but we're still increasing the effective load on the planet. So the more people we have, the more resources we need, the bigger the cities we have. So when we combine that population growth with rapid urbanization, it creates challenges, but it also creates opportunities. So right now we have about 3.5 billion people in the world that live in cities. We're going to add another 2.4 in the next 33 years. So we're going to have about 6 billion people living in cities. We've got to build cities at a faster rate than we've ever done known to man. And that's a massive opportunity when we're looking at responsible design going forward. That's a clean slate. We know we need to build such a massive amount of infrastructure and buildings that we have the opportunity to move beyond sustainability towards responsible design. And the time component comes in with the Paris Agreement. So last year, 195 world leaders came together, and this is unprecedented, came together and ratified action against climate change. And so it all boils down to really the number two. The number two, and that's significant because these world leaders have committed their governments and their economies to limiting the average temperature, annual average temperature, to 2 degrees above pre-industrial times. And so what that means is that number sort of starts, 1800s. The average temperature along the year just kind of bumped along a little bit higher, a little bit lower. There was volcanic activity, it'd go a little higher. But we're moving at an increased rate, and that 2-degree cap is a key. And 2 degrees is what was ratified, but with a goal of 1.5. And where are we today? We're halfway there. Last year, the annual average increase above that pre-industrial time was 0.99 degrees. I'm just going to call that a degree. So we're halfway there. If we're talking about that 2-degree mark, we're halfway there. If we're talking about that 1.5 degree mark, which is the aspiration, we're 2/3 of the way there. And so what does this actually mean in terms of time and development? What it means is effectively the buildings that we're designing need to be carbon zero, so no greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. That's 13 years from now. That's not a very long time. And by 2050, effectively, all the buildings that we currently have and that's millions of buildings around the world, effectively need to go to carbon neutral so we could start to bring carbon back in line. The story's not great right now. Effectively, 75% of what we build is conventional. So most countries and most jurisdictions have an energy code, and most development is just getting over that line, and that's economic driven. That's just trying to get the buildings built. About 25% fall into that category of green or high performance, and that's the majority of what I do. And then less than 1% fall into sustainable, which is that middle ground. That's where we need to be in 13 years, or restorative or regenerative. Now, if we think that in 13 years, everything needs to shift to the center, and in 33 years, everything needs to shift to the center, the reality is it's going to be a balance, right? We're looking for that bell curve. So we need to move to a point where we can make restorative and regenerative design and construction more economically feasible across the board in order for us to move forward. And fundamentally, we need to get there through collaboration, right? There's not a single person that can design a building straight through. And every job I've ever been on, it's been a collaborative working environment, but we need to speed that up. We actually need to go quicker. We've got a clock ticking. And if we look at other industries, they're similar in their need to collaborate. So the aviation industry, we went from a wood and paper airplane in 1903 with a 12-second flight time to a supersonic jet with the Concorde in 1969 to the most fuel-efficient long-range passenger plane in 2009. And that wasn't done without collaboration and actually a single goal, right? So there's this coalition around a common goal for all the teams, all the technical, all the marketing, all it has to coalesce around that common goal. And the same is true for telecommunications. So in the mid-'80s, I didn't have the opportunity to have a big brick phone. I don't know if any of you guys did, but I sure had one of the candy bar phones of the 90s. And I bet most everybody in this room now has that small computer in your pocket, your purse, or your bag that we still call a phone. And again, the advancement of that was rapid, especially from the 90s to 2007. The advancement of that was so quick, and that's something that we can learn from as a built environment design. But the other side of that is the ability to prototype and prototype quickly. And what we do a poor job at is rapidly prototyping. We can learn from other industries, and we could learn about how to generate lots of ideas, how to generate lots of prototypes, build physical models, build them to destroy and to test, so we can test concepts all the way through. So we're not taking a project all the way through, but we're taking that in the prototype. Now, I don't want to say that we don't go through this process at all. So architects, if there are any architects in the crowd, we prototype every project. We're testing massing and orientation, and we're looking at how the building fits on the site. Engineers do the same thing. We're looking at our systems design integrated to the architecture. We're looking at passive technologies against each other, and we're prototyping those as well. But largely, not wholly, but largely, we're doing that in isolation. So we're working in these little silos, and then we come together. And this is a very old school method of decoupled design. So ages and ages ago, and we're getting better as a society. Architects used to design the building, make it look beautiful, make it habitable, pass it over to somebody like myself that would put heating and cooling into it, and then pass that on to the contractors, and they would build it, and people would move in. So it was this very kind of step change, decoupled method. And we've been learning, and in the UK we're moving more towards that integrated design every year. But we need to try to figure out how that prototype cycle happens together in a collaborative, cohesive way. Because right now it's not on a universal stage. Now I've definitely had experiences where I've worked in this, where we get together and there's a lot of effort and energy that are put into that early stage. And I don't know why anybody wouldn't want to work like this. It's the most engaging and fun way to work. You're testing all sorts of ideas. You're throwing the craziest ideas out and seeing if they work. And they just might, and some of them do. But if you don't get to this point where you're actually allowed to or encouraged to test and iterate, we're just going through that same process of Design, 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 pull together, build, inhabit, let's do it again. The thing that's really different between our industry and the likes of, let's take the phone for example, is every single building that we design and build is virtually a prototype, right? We don't build them and then mass produce them. We don't design a building and then build tens or hundreds or thousands of, or millions of the same building. That's not how it works. So our process is much different. And you can imagine when somebody's building the next smartphone version 8, the minute they release that, they don't start version 9 the next day. They've been working on 9, they've been working on 10, and they're using their past experiences and that prototype methodology and that continuous learning to continue to grow for next year's release and the year after. Fundamentally, what we're missing in our industry and what we've got to try to figure out is how we can create this continuous loop of learning. Because right now, we get a team together, we understand the problem, it moves through the design process, even if that's a prototype version, we get to the point where we deliver a design, contractor builds it, and that team dissipates, it goes its separate way. And part of that's wonderful, right? So all those lessons that are learned get dispersed amongst the community. But the hard thing is that it also gets dispersed and diluted. And so that group that might have had a really great idea that in 2 or 3 or 4 more prototype iterations would have really locked on to a way to do it quicker or cheaper or whatever, has just dispersed, and they don't have that ability to feed back in and learn. And we fundamentally don't have a space for that. Universities are doing research. We have organizations within the UK that also do research. But as private sector, we don't have a community. We don't have a collective that allows us. And this is part of what I'm here to talk about, is try to figure out how we and you can all figure out how we do this. I've not figured it out yet. And I've been talking about the technical team, but the reality is we're only a small portion of it. All of us are in buildings. We live, work, sleep. We spend 90% of our time in buildings. That's the figure. So if you think about that, we live, I think I read, it's now 80, 81 years. We spend about 70 years of our lives in buildings. We spend a lot of time in buildings. And so we're all active participants, right? We choose where we go. We choose where we live. We choose where we go to school. We choose all these things, right? But what we don't fundamentally do is choose around sustainable credentials of a building. Why is that? We're all living in buildings. We're all part of it. We all know that we read the papers. We know that we live in this world that's more environmentally aware. So from a stakeholder alignment, we all need to take responsibility. But then there's even the wider group, right? So I've no doubt we have leaders from local and central government. We've got folks that work for FTSE 100 companies. I'm sure we have folks here that work for funds that are in development. And so we need to all come together around that common goal. It's not just the developers, it's not just the design team that's responsibility, because it goes much wider than that. We can design technical buildings that get us there, but if they don't work out economically and they don't work out socially, then they're not responsible. And something, when we talk about accelerating, I've talked about that prototyping methodology and the technical side, and we need to figure that out. And we will as a technical group. But we also have to figure out how we make these things work. Because right now, the knock is that green buildings cost a bit more. And by and large, they probably do. So while we try to figure out how to make these technical buildings more cost-effective, more universal, we also need the other half of the stakeholder group to try to help figure out, actually, how can we make the business models work such that it doesn't have to be straight line right now. Because if we wait that long, the clock's ticking. We got 13 years right now. If we wait till 10 years to get to that, or 9 years, we might miss the boat. So I'm going to leave you guys with a bit of a challenge. So we all know that it's all our responsibility. We all know that the goal is 2 degrees max, right? So we're all in agreement there. I just want everybody here to leave today and try to figure out what you can specifically do in your job, in your personal life, that helps us maintain 2 degrees. Thank you.